They whispered she was past her prime, 43 and fading, a cautionary tale mothers shared with their ambitious daughters. Lady Evelyn Harrow had accepted this verdict, had learned to stand in the shadows while younger women sparkled under candlelight. But on the night her baby's sister married into wealth, beneath the merciless glow of 1,000 candles, the cruelty finally found its mark. And then he appeared. Adrian Ravensleigh, the Duke whose grief had made him untouchable, whose power made him feared. He looked at her with eyes that had forgotten how to see beauty, and spoke words that shattered everything she thought she knew about her place in the world. Pretend you're mine. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. Help us to reach 5,000 subscribers in 2 weeks please. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let us enter London, 1818, into an evening where humiliation became the doorway to an impossible love. The ballroom at Thornbridge Manor burned with the light of 500 candles, their flames casting restless shadows across walls hung with ivory silk and winter roses shipped from France at ruinous expense. The air tasted of champagne and bergamot, of laughter sharp enough to draw blood, of a world Evelyn Harrow had been born into but never truly belonged to. She stood near the French doors, her hands resting lightly on a champagne flute she hadn't tasted. The dress she wore, deep emerald satin, had been fashionable once, perhaps a decade ago. She'd had it altered, the waist taken in, the sleeves updated, but she could feel the whispers it generated like pinpricks against her skin. Around her, women glided in Worth gowns that cost more than Evelyn's annual income. Their jewels caught candlelight with each practiced gesture, their voices bright with the certainty of those who had never questioned whether they deserved to be here. Evelyn had stopped questioning years ago. She had learned to be the sister who required nothing, who caused no trouble, who could fade into wallpaper while her younger sister Clarissa danced with her new husband, finally elevated by her marriage to Lord Pemberton's heir, a man whose fortune in shipping had bought them all a second chance at relevance. The orchestra swelled into a waltz. Couples swept across the polished floor like petals caught in a golden current. Evelyn watched with the detached appreciation of someone observing a painting in a gallery. Beautiful but unreachable, never meant for her. Laughter erupted nearby, cutting and bright. Evelyn didn't need to turn to know it was Clarissa's new circle of friends, young wives and eager debutantes who treated her sister like a prize they'd won. The laughter came again, and this time Evelyn caught fragments of her own name floating on its cruel edge. Poor Evelyn, 43 and still unmarried. Perhaps she's waiting for a miracle, though I cannot imagine what gentleman would overlook such. Well, everything. The words settled like ice in her stomach. She had endured worse. Years of being the aging daughter, the spinster aunt-in-waiting, the woman whose presence at family dinners was tolerated rather than celebrated. But tonight, dressed in her outdated emerald silk at her baby sister's triumph, the casual cruelty felt different. Sharper. Final. She turned toward the French doors, needing air, needing darkness, needing anywhere these people couldn't watch her struggle to maintain composure. Her hand had just touched the cold brass handle when another voice cut through the music, lower but no less poisonous. I heard Lord Ashford showed interest last season, but even he couldn't bear the prospect. Imagine being deemed unsuitable by Lord Ashford. The titters that followed felt like needles against Evelyn's skin. Lord Ashford, with his gambling debts and his reputation for pursuing widows with questionable judgment, who had paid her attention just long enough to make her hope before moving on to someone younger, wealthier, more worthy of his mediocre attentions. Evelyn pushed through the doors into the conservatory, where the air hung thick with the scent of hothouse orchids and night-blooming jasmine. The glass walls rose around her like a cage of stars, the darkness beyond pressing close. She walked quickly between the planters, past the marble fountain where water trickled over carved nymphs, toward the far door that led to the terrace. Behind her, the music continued. The laughter continued. The world continued as it always did, indifferent to the small agonies of those it deemed irrelevant. She reached the terrace and stopped at the stone balustrade, gripping its cold edge with both hands. The night air moved cool against her flushed cheeks. Rain threatened in the clouds overhead, not yet falling but promising to, making the darkness feel close and intimate. Below, the gardens of Thornbridge stretched into shadow, formal hedges and gravel paths disappearing into black. Evelyn closed her eyes and let herself feel it, just for a moment. The loneliness. The bitter understanding that she would always be the sister who didn't matter, the daughter kept because duty demanded it, but never celebrated, never chosen, never seen as anything more than an obligation. Or worse, an object of pity. Tears pressed hot behind her eyelids. She fought them back with the practice of years, breathing slowly through her nose, counting the breaths, telling herself that this too would pass, that she had survived worse than Clarissa's friend's casual cruelty, and would survive this as well. A footstep sounded on the stone behind her. Evelyn's eyes flew open. She straightened quickly, swiping at her face with the back of her hand, mortified that someone had followed her, that her moment of weakness might become tomorrow's gossip. "I did not mean to intrude." The voice was male, deep, and measured, with an edge of something Evelyn could not quite identify. She turned slowly, her heart pounding, and found herself looking at a man who stood at the conservatory door like a figure carved from shadow and starlight. He was tall, dressed in evening clothes that fit him with the kind of perfection that spoke of Seville Row tailors and old money. His dark hair showed silver at the temples, swept back from a face that might have been handsome if not for the severity of its lines. The sharp jaw and high cheekbones, the mouth set in a way that suggested he rarely smiled and found little reason to. But it was his eyes that stopped Evelyn's breath. Dark gray, almost colorless in the dim light from the ballroom behind him. They fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel suddenly, shockingly visible. She recognized him, though they had never been introduced. Everyone in England knew Adrian Ravensleigh, Duke of Ravensleigh. He appeared in the society papers with the regularity of royalty, always photographed at some function or another, always alone since the death of his young Duchess 5 years ago. The rumors about him were endless. That he was cold as winter stone, that he had loved his wife so completely her death had frozen something vital in him, that he was the wealthiest, most powerful, most dangerous man in England, and no one dared cross him. "Your Grace," Evelyn managed, dropping into a curtsy that felt clumsy and inadequate. "I apologize. I did not know anyone was here." He moved forward with deliberate grace, stopping a few feet from her. Up close, she could see the threads of silver at his temples, the faint lines around his eyes that suggested he was older than she'd thought, or perhaps simply wearier. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said quietly. "The offense tonight was not yours." Evelyn felt her face flame. He had heard then. He had been somewhere in that glittering crowd and heard Clarissa's friend's mockery, heard the laughter, heard her name dragged through the casual cruelty of people who had nothing better to do than sharpen their tongues on those weaker than themselves. "I should return inside," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She moved to step past him, desperate to escape before the humiliation could deepen, before he could offer her pity or worse. Advice on how to better endure her place in the world. His hand moved, not touching her, but raising slightly as if to stop her. "Wait." Evelyn froze. She had been given orders all her life, from her father, from Clarissa, from everyone who believed they knew better than she did what was good for her. But this was different. This was not an order. This was a request, offered in a voice that held something she had never heard directed at her before. Respect. He studied her face in the dim light, and Evelyn had the strange sensation that he was truly seeing her, not the dress or the lack of jewels or the tear-stained cheeks, but something deeper, something she had kept hidden for so long, she had almost forgotten it existed. "You should not have to endure such treatment," he said at last. "Not from them. Not from anyone." The words unlocked something in Evelyn's chest, something painful and raw. She shook her head, unable to speak, unable to explain that this was simply how her world worked, that she had no power to change it, that survival meant accepting what could not be altered. But the Duke of Ravensleigh was not finished. He took one step closer, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and something else, something dark and expensive that made her pulse quicken. And then he spoke the words that would change everything. "Pretend you're mine." Evelyn had dressed with care that morning, her hands steady as she'd fastened the pearl buttons of her cream silk gown. The dress was older than she cared to admit, but she'd spent weeks updating it with new lace at the collar, telling herself that perhaps this wedding would be different, that Clarissa's happiness might somehow create space for her own. Hope was a dangerous indulgence for a woman of 43, but she had allowed herself to feel it anyway as her carriage rattled toward Thornbridge Manor through the grey London morning. The first crack came in the entrance hall. Her mother swept past with barely a glance, too consumed with fussing over Clarissa's Belgian lace veil to acknowledge Evelyn's arrival. The second came when she was seated for the ceremony, not with family but 3 rows back, wedged between distant cousins who made no effort to hide their surprise that she'd been invited at all. But the third blow, the one that truly shattered her carefully maintained composure, came during the reception. She had been standing near the champagne fountain, trying to appear occupied with adjusting her gloves, when Clarissa's new circle descended like jeweled hawks. They didn't bother lowering their voices, and why would they? Women like Evelyn had long ago learned to be deaf to their own humiliation. Lady Pemberton examined her with the clinical detachment of someone appraising damaged goods. How terribly generous of Clarissa to include her spinster sister. Though I suppose family obligation extends even to the most unfortunate cases. The tittering that followed felt like needles against Evelyn's skin, sharp and precisely aimed. Another voice joined in, younger and more cutting. I heard she's been on the market for over 20 years. Imagine the desperation. Evelyn's fingers tightened on her champagne flute until she feared the crystal might crack. She set it down with trembling hands and walked toward the conservatory doors, her vision blurring at the edges. Behind her, she heard more laughter, heard her name spoken with that particular inflection that turned it into something pitiful and small, a cautionary tale mothers would share with their ambitious daughters. She pushed through the doors into blessed darkness, past the hothouse orchids and night-blooming jasmine, their heavy perfume making her dizzy. The conservatory stretched before her like a tunnel, and she moved through it quickly, desperate for air, for darkness, for anywhere these people couldn't watch her struggle to maintain the composure she'd spent decades perfecting. The terrace hit her with cold air that felt like a slap, clarifying and cruel. She gripped the stone balustrade with both hands and allowed herself, just for one moment, to feel the full weight of her invisibility. 43 years of being too much and not enough all at once. 43 years of watching younger women be chosen while she stood in corners, waiting for a kindness that never came. She had told herself she was content, that she didn't need marriage or children or love. But standing here in her carefully updated dress at her baby sister's triumph, Evelyn understood with brutal clarity that she had been lying to herself for decades. A tear slipped down her cheek, then another, and she didn't bother wiping them away. Let the night see her grief. Let the darkness bear witness to the parts of herself she kept carefully hidden from the cruel light of day. That was when she heard the footstep behind her, and everything changed. Adrian Ravensleigh had not wanted to attend this wedding. He attended nothing unless absolutely necessary, and the marriage of Lord Pemberton's son to some country girl with social aspirations fell well outside the boundaries of necessity. But his aunt, the formidable Dowager Marchioness of Thornbury, had insisted with that particular tone that brooked no argument. "You cannot hide forever, Adrian," she'd said, and he had learned long ago that arguing with her was an exercise in futility. So he had come, had stood through the tedious ceremony watching two people make promises they probably wouldn't keep, had endured the reception with its forced gaiety and transparent social climbing. He had been calculating the earliest moment he could leave without causing offense when he'd heard it. That particular kind of feminine cruelty that sounded like music but cut like broken glass. He'd watched the woman in the cream silk dress walk away with her spine rigid and her hands clenched at her sides, and something in her careful composure had made him follow. Perhaps it was the way she held herself together even as she was clearly breaking. Perhaps it was the memory of his own Margaret, who had been mocked by these same circles for the crime of loving a duke who actually loved her back. Perhaps he was simply tired of watching cruelty go unchallenged while society applauded itself for its good breeding. He found her on the terrace, gripping the stone balustrade as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Even from behind, he could see the slight tremor in her shoulders, the too careful breathing of someone fighting tears with the practice of decades. When he spoke, she startled like a wounded bird, turning to face him with eyes that widened in recognition and something that looked dangerously close to mortification. She curtsied, apologized, began to retreat with all the trained responses of a woman who had been taught her entire life to make herself smaller, to take up less space, to apologize for the inconvenience of existing. But Adrian was done watching people make themselves smaller to accommodate the cruelty of others. "You have nothing to apologize for," he told her, meaning every word. "The offense tonight was not yours." She flushed, understanding that he'd witnessed her humiliation, and tried to flee. He stopped her with a single word, surprised by the urgency he felt to keep her from disappearing back into that ballroom, where they would consume what was left of her dignity like wolves. In the dim lights spilling from the conservatory, he could see she was beautiful, not in the obvious way society valued with its emphasis on youth and conventional prettiness, but in the way storms were beautiful, all barely contained power and devastating grace. She was older than the simpering debutantes, old enough to have lived and lost and learned to survive it. There was intelligence in her eyes, and pain, and something else he recognized because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. Resignation, the belief that this was all life would ever offer. And Adrian, who had felt nothing for 5 years, who had built walls so high around his grief that nothing could touch him, felt something crack open in his chest at the sight of this woman giving up. "Pretend you're mine," he said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. His motives were unclear, even to himself. Was this rescue? Revenge against the cruelty he'd witnessed? Or was it something more dangerous, the first stirring of feeling in a heart he'd thought was permanently frozen? He offered his arm, steady and certain, even though inside he felt neither. "One dance," he said quietly. "Let them see you with me. Let them wonder what they've been missing all along." The ballroom had reached that fevered pitch where champagne and gossip blended into something volatile and intoxicating. The orchestra played on, oblivious, as 300 guests maintained a pretense of celebration while calculating social advantage with every word and glance. Fortunes were made and lost in moments like these, reputations built or destroyed by a single well-placed whisper. No one noticed when the conservatory doors opened. Not at first, but then someone saw them. The Duke of Ravensleigh, who hadn't danced since his Duchess died 5 years ago, who attended society functions like a ghost haunting the edges of the living, walking into the ballroom with a woman on his arm. Not just any woman. The spinster Harrow sister, the one they'd been mocking not 15 minutes earlier, now moving across the threshold with her hand resting on the arm of the most desired man in England. The whispers started like a match striking tinder. They spread in concentric circles outward from that first shocked observer, conversation faltering and dying in waves, until the orchestra stumbled through half a measure before the conductor, confused by the sudden silence, managed to recover his composure and push his musicians forward. Evelyn felt every eye turn toward them like a physical weight pressing against her skin. The urge to run was overwhelming, to release Adrian's arm and disappear before she could humiliate them both further, before whatever madness had seized him could be exposed as the cruel joke it must surely be. But his hand covered hers where it rested on his sleeve, warm and anchoring and impossibly steady, and he kept walking with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once questioned his right to be anywhere, to do anything, to choose anyone. They passed Lady Pemberton, whose face had gone slack with shock, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. Past Clarissa's bridesmaids, their earlier cruelty replaced by something that looked dangerously close to panic as they realized they'd just spent 15 minutes mocking the woman now escorted by a duke. Past Evelyn's own mother, whose champagne glass had frozen halfway to her lips, her face a mask of horror and furious calculation as she tried to understand what this meant for the family's precarious social position. Adrian guided Evelyn toward the center of the ballroom with deliberate intent, where couples had hastily cleared space as if they'd entered a space too charged with electricity to safely occupy. And Evelyn understood with dawning terror exactly what he intended. He was going to dance with her. Here. Now. In front of everyone who had spent years teaching her she wasn't worth being seen. "Your Grace," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible over the music, "you don't have to do this. I release you from whatever obligation." "I know," he interrupted, turning to face her with those gray eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense she'd ever built. but I want to." He bowed, formal and deliberate, the kind of bow reserved for royalty or the highest-ranking ladies of the realm. Then he extended his hand, and his voice rang out clear in the hushed ballroom. "Lady Evelyn Harrow, may I have this dance?" The question hung in the air between them, impossible to misinterpret, a public declaration that this was not pity or charity but choice. Evelyn's hand trembled as she placed it in his, and behind them she heard her mother make a sound of pure distress, heard Clarissa's sharp intake of breath, heard the ballroom erupt into frantic whispers that buzzed like angry hornets suddenly released from their nest. But Adrian pulled her into the dance frame with practiced grace, his hands settling at her waist with a possessiveness that made her breath catch, and suddenly nothing else mattered except the warmth of his touch and the terrifying, exhilarating feeling of being truly seen for the first time in her life. Adrian guided her away from the ballroom as soon as the waltz ended, before her family could descend with their questions and recriminations, before society could fully process what they'd witnessed and decide how to respond. He seemed to know the house better than she would have expected, finding corridors she hadn't known existed, until they stood in a quiet gallery lined with portraits of long-dead Pemberton ancestors whose painted eyes followed them with what looked like disapproval. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken things. Evelyn's heart was still racing from the dance, from the feel of his hand at her waist, from the weight of 300 pairs of eyes watching them move together. She pressed one hand against her stomach, trying to steady her breathing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "I've made a spectacle of you," she said finally, her voice unsteady. "They'll say terrible things. About both of us." "Let them," Adrian replied with a vehemence that surprised them both. For 5 years he had moved through society like a ghost, present but not participating, maintaining the bare minimum of social obligation while feeling nothing. And now this woman in her carefully updated cream silk had made him feel something other than the constant ache of loss. Anger, yes, but also something more dangerous. Hope. Evelyn looked up at him, searching his face in the flickering gaslight for answers he wasn't sure he could provide. "Why did you do that? You don't even know me." "No," Adrian agreed quietly, "but I know cruelty when I see it. I know what it looks like when someone is drowning in plain sight while everyone pretends not to notice." He paused, then added with brutal honesty, "And I know what it feels like to stop wanting anything, because wanting only leads to loss." The confession hung between them, more intimate than the dance had been, more revealing than any amount of polite conversation. Evelyn's eyes widened, and Adrian saw recognition there, the understanding of someone who knew exactly what he meant because she'd lived it herself from a different angle. "Your wife," she said softly. Not a question, but an acknowledgement. "Margaret," Adrian said, her name still a knife in his chest after 5 years of trying to let her go. "She was everything I didn't know I needed until I had her. And when she died, when that fever took her in 3 days, I decided it was safer to feel nothing than to risk feeling that kind of pain again." Evelyn nodded slowly, her own pain visible in the set of her shoulders. "I understand that. I've spent my entire life making myself smaller, quieter, less troublesome. Because every time I wanted something, every time I hoped for more than the scraps I was given, life showed me I was foolish for believing I deserved better." They stood in the corridor, two people shaped by different losses, but wearing the same armor of resignation, the same careful distance from anything that might hurt them. Adrian reached out slowly, giving her time to step back, and touched her cheek with fingers that trembled slightly despite his attempt at control. "What if we were both wrong?" he asked, the question directed as much at himself as at her. "What if making ourselves smaller didn't protect us at all? What if it only made us half alive, going through motions while the world passed us by?" Evelyn's breath caught, her eyes searching his face. "Then what do we do?" Adrian didn't have an answer, not really. He only knew that for the first time in 5 years, he felt something other than the crushing weight of grief and guilt. He felt possibility, and it terrified him almost as much as it thrilled him. This fragile hope that perhaps life wasn't finished with him yet. "We choose," he said finally, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "Right now, in this moment, we choose to be brave enough to want something again, even if it costs us everything we've carefully built to protect ourselves." They found her family in the blue drawing room, a space clearly chosen for its distance from the ballroom and the curious ears of 300 guests. Her mother stood by the fireplace with the rigid posture of someone preparing for battle. Clarissa sat on the settee still in her wedding gown, her face flushed with anger and champagne. Thomas, Evelyn's older brother, looked exhausted by the prospect of managing yet another family crisis that threatened their precarious social standing. The moment Evelyn entered with Adrian still at her side, her mother turned with the expression of a judge preparing to deliver sentence. "Evelyn, you will return home with us immediately. This display has caused quite enough damage for one evening." Evelyn felt the old instinct rise like muscle memory, the impulse to apologize, to obey, to make herself convenient and small and accommodating. 43 years of training didn't disappear in a single evening, no matter how transformative that evening had been. But Adrian's presence beside her, solid and unwavering, reminded her that she had a choice. She had always had a choice. She had simply been too afraid to make it. "No," she said quietly. The single word fell into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples that spread outward into shocked silence. Her mother's face flushed with color, her eyes narrowing in that way that had always made Evelyn shrink and comply. "I beg your pardon." "I said no, mother." Evelyn's voice grew stronger with each word, as if speaking the truth was giving her access to reserves of courage she hadn't known existed. "I won't be returning home. I won't be tucked away in the country while you wait for this scandal to fade so you can pretend tonight never happened." "How dare you speak to me this way?" her mother hissed, taking a step forward. "After everything we've sacrificed for you, given you a home when you failed to secure a husband, tolerated your presence. What have you sacrificed?" Evelyn interrupted, and the words came out sharper than she'd intended, but no less true. "You sacrificed nothing, mother. You tolerated me because duty demanded it, but you never once made me feel like I was worth more than your disappointment. You never defended me when Clarissa's friends mocked me. You never suggested I might deserve better than Lord Ashford's half-hearted attentions. You simply waited for me to disappear quietly into spinsterhood." Thomas stepped forward, attempting his usual role as peacemaker. "Evelyn, be reasonable." His grace was simply being kind. "Surely you understand that a man of his position—" "Lord Harrow," Adrian interrupted, his voice cold as winter frost. "I suggest you reconsider your next words very carefully. Your sister showed more courage tonight than I've witnessed in most men twice her size. If you cannot see her worth, if you've spent years overlooking it, that speaks to your limitations, not hers." Clarissa, who had been silent until now, finally spoke with the petulance of someone whose special day had been ruined. "What about my wedding? Everyone will only remember your spectacle, Evelyn. You've ruined everything I worked for, made yourself the center of attention like you always." "Enough," Evelyn said, and there was steel in her voice that surprised everyone in the room, possibly including herself. She looked at her baby sister, at the woman she had spent decades protecting and supporting and sacrificing for, the sister whose happiness had always mattered more than her own. "I'm done apologizing for being seen, Clarissa. I'm done making myself invisible so you can shine brighter." She turned to Adrian, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, and made the choice that would change everything. "Your Grace, you mentioned earlier that your aunt might offer her protection and sponsorship. Does that offer still stand?" Adrian's expression softened in a way that made her chest ache. "It does. The Dowager Marchioness would be honored to sponsor you for the season. You need never return to a place that made you feel less than you are, Lady Evelyn." Evelyn looked at her family one last time, at the mother who had never truly seen her, the sister who had never valued her, the brother who had never once stood up for her when it mattered. And then she made the choice that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. "Then I accept. I'll stay in London. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't just Evelyn's story, it's yours. It's every time you make yourself smaller so someone else can feel bigger. Every time you apologize for taking up space. Every time you convince yourself you don't deserve more because you want to hurt too much. If you don't engage with this content, if you don't like, comment, and subscribe, you're telling yourself the same lie Evelyn believed for 43 years. That you're not worth being seen. That your story doesn't matter. Prove yourself wrong. Engage now." The Dowager Marchioness of Thornbury was not what Evelyn expected. She had braced herself for a stern, calculating woman who would view her as a charity case, another broken thing to be fixed for her nephew's sake, a project to be managed with efficiency and minimal emotional investment. Instead, She found herself sitting across from a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who looked at Evelyn with something that might have been approval, or perhaps recognition. "So you're the one who finally woke him up," the dowager said without preamble, pouring tea with hands that remained steady despite her age. "I was beginning to think Adrian would spend the rest of his life as a walking memorial to Margaret. God rest her soul. But she would have been absolutely furious with him for wasting 5 years in that mausoleum of grief." Evelyn accepted the delicate porcelain teacup, unsure how to respond to such directness. The dowager's London townhouse was elegant but comfortable, filled with books that showed signs of actual reading and art that had been chosen for beauty rather than investment value. It felt like a home rather than a showpiece. "Your Grace, I want to be clear that I'm not trying to replace." "Of course you're not," the dowager interrupted with a dismissive wave. "No one replaces anyone, girl. We're not furniture to be swapped out when we break. We're people with the capacity to love more than once if we're brave enough to survive the first loss." She fixed Evelyn with a penetrating stare that seemed to see straight through 43 years of carefully constructed defenses. "The question is, are you brave enough? Or will you let fear convince you to run back to that family who never deserved you?" Over the following weeks, Evelyn discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known existed. The dowager was a ruthless tutor, not in the usual social graces that Evelyn had been raised with, but in something far more valuable and dangerous: confidence. The ability to occupy space without apology. "Stop apologizing," the dowager would say sharply whenever Evelyn began a sentence with "I'm sorry," or "I don't mean to bother you. You're a grown woman with intelligent opinions and valid needs. State them clearly and stop acting as if your existence requires permission." She taught Evelyn how to enter a room without immediately searching for the shadows to hide in, how to meet the stares of society matrons without flinching or dropping her gaze, how to carry herself as if she belonged anywhere she chose to be. But more than that, more important than any social skill, she taught Evelyn that worthiness wasn't something bestowed by others like a gift to be grateful for. It was something you claimed for yourself, something you decided you possessed regardless of whether anyone else agreed. Adrian called every afternoon, proper and formal under his aunt's watchful eye, but Evelyn could see the way he looked at her changing day by day, not with pity or obligation anymore, but with something that looked dangerously like admiration, like desire, like the careful hope of someone who had convinced himself he would never feel anything again but was discovering he'd been wrong. One afternoon, as they walked through Hyde Park with the dowager trailing at a discreet distance, Adrian said quietly, "You're different than you were at the wedding. Stronger, more certain." Evelyn considered this observation, turning it over in her mind like a stone polished smooth by water. "No, I think I'm the same person I always was. I'm just finally allowing her to exist in public instead of hiding her away where she couldn't cause trouble or make people uncomfortable." Adrian stopped walking abruptly, turning to face her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Then God help London society. Because the woman I'm beginning to know, the real you beneath all those years of trained accommodation, is absolutely formidable." For the first time in her life, Evelyn didn't deflect the compliment with self-deprecation or minimize herself to make him more comfortable. She simply smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones like something she'd been waiting her whole life to hear. "Yes," she said simply, "I am." Lord Ashford appeared at the dowager's door on a gray Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Evelyn had left her family. He carried flowers, expensive hothouse roses that must have cost a small fortune, and wore an expression of calculated concern that immediately set Evelyn's teeth on edge. She recognized that look. She'd seen it before, last season, when he'd paid her just enough attention to make her hope before moving on to someone younger and wealthier and more worth his mediocre efforts. "My dear Lady Evelyn," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth as the butler showed him into the morning room. "I've been so worried about you. Society has been quite unkind in its speculation about your situation." The dowager was present, as propriety demanded for an unmarried woman receiving a male caller, and Evelyn felt her spine stiffen at Ashford's presumption. This was the man who had courted her with just enough sincerity to wound when he inevitably lost interest, who had made her feel for 3 months like she might finally be chosen only to discard her the moment a better option appeared. "Lord Ashford, I wasn't aware we were close enough to warrant your concern about my welfare. Evelyn kept her voice cool, drawing on the lessons the Dowager had been drilling into her about not apologizing for setting boundaries. His smile didn't waver, though something flickered in his eyes that might have been an annoyance at her lack of gratitude. We were once quite friendly, as I recall. I thought perhaps we might renew our acquaintance before your association with His Grace becomes too complicated for you to extricate yourself. The threat was delicate but unmistakable, wrapped in concern like poison in honey. Evelyn understood immediately what he was really saying. He was here to remind her that she was still the desperate spinster he'd rejected, to suggest that she should be grateful for any attention, to imply that Adrian's interest would inevitably fade and she'd be left with nothing and no one. "I'm afraid I don't understand your meaning," Evelyn said, though she understood perfectly. What complications could possibly arise from a duke paying an honorable court to a lady he finds worthy of his regard? Ashford's expression hardened slightly, the false concern cracking to reveal calculation beneath. "My dear Lady Evelyn, we must be realistic. A man like Ravensleigh, with his wealth and title and tragic history, he's still grieving his duchess. This infatuation with you, however charming, will pass as these things do. And when it does, you'll need friends. I'm offering to be that friend, to provide you with a respectable alternative before you find yourself completely ruined by association." "How extraordinarily generous," came Adrian's voice from the doorway, cold and dangerous in a way Evelyn had never heard before. "Offering friendship to a woman you publicly rejected less than a year ago. Tell me, Ashford, what changed? Could it possibly be that Lady Evelyn is now under my protection and you've calculated there might be some advantage in that for you?" Ashford paled but rallied with the desperate bravado of a man who'd already committed to his course of action. "Your Grace, I merely thought to spare Lady Evelyn the inevitable heartbreak when your interest wanes. Surely you cannot expect anyone to believe this is anything more than a passing fancy." Adrian crossed the room with predatory grace, each step deliberate and controlled. "You thought to manipulate Lady Evelyn by reminding her of past rejections and suggesting my regard is temporary. You thought to position yourself as her savior from a situation you're painting as temporary madness on my part." He stopped directly in front of Ashford, and despite being roughly the same height, Adrian somehow seemed to tower over him. "You thought wrong." He moved to Evelyn's side and took her hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture that was both protective and possessive, a public claim that no one could misinterpret. "Lady Evelyn, I apologize that you had to endure this man's presence and his transparent attempts at manipulation." Lord Ashford was just leaving. Then Adrian turned back to Ashford with eyes like winter frost. "And Ashford, if I hear you've spoken Lady Evelyn's name in any context other than utmost respect, if I hear you've suggested to anyone that my regard for her is anything less than genuine and permanent, you'll discover exactly how unpleasant I can make life for those who displease me. Do we understand each other?" After Ashford retreated, practically fleeing the room, Evelyn found herself trembling, not with fear, but with the overwhelming realization that someone had finally defended her without expecting anything in return, without making her feel like she owed them the basic decency of respect. Adrian still held her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "I meant what I said to him. This isn't charity or pity or some passing fancy. This is—" He paused, searching for words. "This is the first thing that's felt real in 5 years. It terrifies me," Evelyn admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Me too," Adrian said. "But perhaps being terrified together is better than being safely numb alone." The garden party at the Dowager's country estate was a calculated assault on London society, a carefully orchestrated statement that Lady Evelyn Harrow was not a scandal to be whispered about in corners, but a woman to be respected and accepted. Every influential family received an engraved invitation, including Evelyn's own, who arrived looking uncomfortable and uncertain of their position in this new social landscape. The gardens were spectacular, late summer roses in full bloom and tables set with crystal and silver that caught the afternoon sun. 200 guests wandered the gravel paths, their conversations a blend of genuine pleasure and barely suppressed curiosity about what exactly the Duke of Ravensleigh would say about his intentions toward the woman everyone had spent years dismissing. Adrian had planned this moment with military precision. When the guests were assembled on the south lawn, champagne flowing and conversation at its peak. He stood and called for attention with the effortless command of someone born to power and accustomed to being obeyed without question. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this afternoon. I have an announcement that I hope you'll receive with the same joy I feel in making it, though I confess your reaction matters far less to me than Lady Evelyn's happiness. The garden fell silent except for the distant buzz of bees in the lavender and the nervous rustle of silk as people shifted to see better. Evelyn, standing beside the dowager near the rose arbor, felt her heart begin to race. They had discussed this moment, had planned exactly what Adrian would say, but the reality of it, the public nature and the irrevocability, suddenly felt immense and terrifying. Adrian's eyes found hers across the garden, holding her gaze with an intensity that made everything else fade. Lady Evelyn Harrow has done me the extraordinary honor of allowing me to court her formally and publicly. I intend to prove to her, and to all of you, that she is the most remarkable woman I have ever known, second only to my late wife, who I know would have adored her. The mention of Margaret was deliberate, a signal that he wasn't betraying his past but honoring it by choosing to live again, by refusing to let grief turn him into a monument to what he'd lost. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Evelyn saw her mother's face go white, saw Clarissa grip her husband's arm so tightly her knuckles showed pale, saw Thomas close his eyes as if in pain. But she also saw others, women her own age who had been dismissed as too old or too plain or too inconvenient, looking at her with something that might have been hope, as if her story was showing them that invisibility wasn't a permanent condition, that being overlooked didn't mean being worthless. Adrian crossed the garden to her side with measured steps, took her hand in full view of 200 witnesses, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Lady Evelyn, you have spent years believing you were invisible. I'm here to tell you, in front of everyone who matters and many who don't, that you are the only person I see. You have brought me back to life, and I intend to spend whatever time we're given proving that you made the right choice in allowing me into your heart." The applause that followed was tentative at first, then grew stronger as people realized the Duke of Ravensleigh was not asking for their approval, but simply informing them of a reality they would have to accept. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes but refused to let them fall, refused to give anyone the satisfaction of thinking she was overwhelmed or uncertain. Later, when most of the guests had departed and only family remained, Evelyn's mother approached with careful steps and an expression that almost looked like humility, though it sat uncomfortably on features more accustomed to judgment. "Evelyn," her mother said carefully, each word chosen with visible effort, "I may have been mistaken about certain things, about your prospects, about your worth." It wasn't an apology, not really. It was acknowledgement, and from her mother, that was as close as Evelyn would ever get to an admission of wrongdoing. She could have thrown it back in her mother's face, could have listed every wound and slight accumulated over 43 years. But she found she didn't want to. The woman who had needed that validation, who had craved her mother's approval like a plant craves sunlight, no longer existed. "Yes," Evelyn said simply, her voice calm and certain. "You were." And she walked away, toward Adrian who stood waiting by the fountain, toward the dowager who smiled with fierce pride, toward the life she was building on her own terms. She didn't need her family's belated acceptance. She had already accepted herself. 6 months after that night on the terrace at Thornbridge Manor, Evelyn stood in the morning room of Ravensleigh House, watching the London season unfold in the square below. She wore a gown of deep sapphire silk that had been made specifically for her, not altered from someone else's cast-offs, but created by a modiste who had listened to what Evelyn wanted and then made it real. The woman reflected in the window looked like someone who belonged in these elegant rooms, in this life of privilege and visibility. But the truth was more complex and more beautiful than simple transformation. Evelyn hadn't been rescued by Adrian, no matter what the romantics in society whispered. She had been seen by him, yes, defended and supported and cherished in ways she had never experienced. But the transformation that had taken place over these months was her own work, built in small daily choices. The first time she stated an opinion without apologizing. The first time she entered a room without immediately seeking the shadows. The first time she looked at her reflection and recognized the woman staring back, claimed her as someone worthy of respect and love. Adrian appeared in the doorway, still in his riding clothes, and the Adrian appeared in the doorway, still in his riding clothes, and the smile that crossed his face when he saw her was everything she'd never dared to hope for. Not the grief-stricken Duke anymore, not the man frozen by loss, but someone who had learned to live again without forgetting what he'd survived. "Ready?" he asked, extending his hand. Tonight they would attend the Hastings ball, the first time Evelyn would appear as Adrian's official betrothed, wearing his ring and his name-to-be. It would be a test. Society could be cruel to women who dared to rise above their assigned station, who refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose. But Evelyn was no longer afraid of society's cruelty. She had survived worse than gossip. She had survived 43 years of believing herself unworthy, and nothing London's matrons could say would ever wound her as deeply as she had once wounded herself with her own resigned acceptance of invisibility. She took Adrian's offered arm, and together they descended to the waiting carriage. The ride to the Hastings residence was quiet, comfortable, the silence of two people who no longer needed to fill every moment with words. When they arrived, the footman handed them down, and Evelyn paused for just a moment at the base of the steps, looking up at the mansion blazing with light and music. "Second thoughts?" Adrian asked quietly, his hand covering hers on his arm. "No," Evelyn said, and meant it absolutely. "I was just thinking about the woman who stood on a terrace 6 months ago, convinced she was invisible, wishing I could tell her what was coming." "What would you tell her?" Evelyn smiled, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones like something she'd been born knowing but had forgotten until now. That she was never invisible. She just needed to believe she was worth being seen. They climbed the steps together, and when the butler announced them, the Duke of Ravensleigh and Lady Evelyn Harrow, heads turned. Whispers started like they always did, rippling outward from their entrance. Some would always see her as the desperate spinster who had somehow ensnared a duke. Some would always question her worthiness, would speculate about what he saw in her, would wait for the inevitable moment when he came to his senses. But Evelyn walked into that ballroom with her head high and her hand on Adrian's arm, and the unshakable knowledge that her worth had never been dependent on anyone else's ability to recognize it. She had always been remarkable. She had simply needed to believe it herself, needed to claim it as truth rather than waiting for permission to exist fully in the world. As they took the floor for the first waltz, Adrian leaned close and whispered against her ear, "You're magnificent, Evelyn." "Absolutely magnificent." Evelyn smiled, feeling the music swell around them, feeling the eyes watching them from every corner of the ballroom. But none of it mattered except this moment, this man, and the woman she had finally allowed herself to become. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. "I know." And she danced with the confidence of a woman who had learned the most important lesson of all, that being seen wasn't a gift someone else bestowed. It was a right she claimed for herself, a choice she made every day to take up space without apology, to want without shame, to believe that she deserved everything she'd spent 43 years convincing herself she didn't. The forgotten sister had finally remembered she was never meant to be forgotten at all. You've watched Evelyn's entire journey. 9 chapters, thousands of words, hours of storytelling. And if you made it this far without engaging, without liking, commenting, subscribing, then ask yourself why. Why are you still treating yourself the way Evelyn's family treated her? Like you don't matter enough to take up space? Every person who scrolls past without engaging is choosing invisibility. Is that really who you want to be? Hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel. Comment below with the exact moment you saw yourself in Evelyn's story. Do it now. Because your engagement isn't just analytics, it's you finally saying, "I matter. My story matters. I refuse to be invisible." Stop hiding. Be seen. Engage now. Sometimes the stories that change us aren't the ones with perfect heroes and simple endings. They're the ones that show us the truth we've been avoiding. That we've been making ourselves small not because the world demanded it, but because we were too afraid to find out what might happen if we finally took up space. Evelyn's story is your story if you let it be. The question is, will you? Thank you for watching. Now go be magnificent. I will see you in my next video.